Unity. Hello, I'm Kendall Brian Hunter, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. So this is sweet potato fries. I get to eat this once I'm done with ketchup and Parmesan cheese. Healthy, healthy. So, new book, First Corinthians. As always, these books are out of chronological order, unlike the Doctrine and Covenants, which for the most part is in chronological order. I think section 10 is a little bit out of place. And then the last two sections were added in back when I was a little kid. But other than that, it's Doctrine and Covenants chronological, and this isn't really chronological. So here we go. Then remember, always go to the Bible dictionary and read the Pauline epistles for background information. They have outlines there, but it's helpful to write your own outlines. Read the chapter headings, underline the Joseph Smith translation changes, because there's some that are really, really important. In fact, some of the best quotables of Paul are really changed in the Joseph Smith translation. So, it's always a bit grating when you show up to church and someone's not quoting from the Joseph Smith translation. It's like, that's not what Paul said according to the Joseph Smith translation, but you do that in moderation. Now, here's a trivia thing. This is actually the second of three epistles. As you read in 1 Corinthians 5:9 and 2 Corinthians 13:1, there's actually a missing first epistle. So what we're reading is actually 2 Corinthians, and what we call 2 Corinthians is 3 Corinthians. And that goes back to that there's missing books in the Bible. So what the Book of Mormon talks about, how what we have as canon isn't the complete canon. We don't believe in the Bible's all sufficient. There's stuff missing. There's different collections and versions of text out there, different Bibles, and even you have the same Bible books are in the different order. Catholic Bibles have the Apocrypha. Ukrainian and Russian Bibles put the Catholic or general epistles ahead of the Pauline epistles. So, canon is not all set. So just like last time, I'm going to focus on themes now instead of going through it sequentially, and that I think it works better for this get to the point format. You just don't want to get bogged down doing a inch by inch dungeon crawl, as you used to say for playing Dungeons and Dragons. This will get to the point quickly. So the first thing, and this I'll cover, most of this podcast will be about this, divisions. Divisions, that's the Telestial tapeworm. So in read 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 11 through 13. Now, it talks about one is Paul, one is Apollos, one is Christ. Cephas is Peter. Apollos, as you read in the book of Acts, was a very gifted speaker. He's a proselyte. He has a Greek name. So part of that, Jews, Greeks coming together, the ethnic tensions in the church. And what was going on is that in Corinth, people were aligning themselves to these different people, be it converts that got associated with them. And so they show up to church. It was creating confusion because said, I was converted by this person, I was converted by Peter. No, well, I'm actually following Jesus Christ. This gets alluded to in section 76, verses 99 through 101, that when you have divisions in the church and members getting emotionally attached to church leaders or to church rock stars, it creates a problem. In fact, it's a telestial pattern. When you say, I follow this person, I follow that person, it's telestial. You can read it, and this is the reason why, is that people who start following this pattern of getting emotionally attached to leaders and such, it says, but they received not the gospel, neither the testimony of Jesus, neither the prophets, neither the everlasting covenant. That is, when you get in a situation where you get attached or focus on a person as a spiritual champion, or you see church as a political party, you're not following the gospel. You're getting attached to a person, and it prevents you from developing spiritually, and it causes divisions in the ward because these general authorities really aren't as divided as some people make it. I mean, there's friction between Brigham Young and Orson Pratt. Elder McConkie had to get his wrist slapped once. Kind of funny. Elder McConkie wrote one sentence back in 1958, and people still don't want to forgive him for it, even though he offered a retraction. It gives you the illusion of faithfulness, but what's really going on is you're just getting an emotional attachment to a person rather getting converted, and you focus on a series of proof texts. So let me go this a little bit in depth. It's once I explain it to you, you're going to next time you show up at the church, you're going to see it. Next time there's a discussion or a little bit of contention about stuff. It's first of all, is having a favorite general authority, and this is what Elder Henry or President Henry B. Eyring said in his book To Draw Closer to God. He said, "There's a danger in deciding who your favorite prophet is, just as there is in having a favorite living general authority or a favorite bishop of your ward, or a favorite visiting teacher. The danger is that you may not listen to the most important messenger to you, who's always the one that God sent to you now." And you think about that. I've had people ask, "Okay, who's your favorite general authority?" And President Eyring says, no, that's not a good problem. Paul counsels that, is that these emotional attachments get in the way. You get people are really excited about hearing Elder Holland talk in General Conference, but what happens if Elder Holland passes on or he gets released? You get attached to a bishop or a teacher, and they get released, and then your testimony disappears. We've had a similar problem. I don't know about you, but what's happened to the high priest in your stake? When was they start having to go back meet with the elders? We've lost some high priests who were kind of caught up with things, thought the church was supposed to be run a certain way, and then the prophet says, "Okay, you're going to be meeting with the elders," and no. So that's one level, having a favorite general authority. And the other thing too is the devices that comes from when you focus on a general authority as a end-all be-all in the gospel. This is more of a baby boomer Gen X type thing, where we have a question. Someone says, "Elder McConkie said this." Another person says, "Well, Elder Talmadge said this other thing." No, Elder John A. Widso said something else. Well, B.H. Roberts said that. That's what Paul's, a variation of what Paul's talking about, is you're quoting an authority, but you're not understanding the gospel. Two stories. One, I got an email a couple of years ago from someone who wanted to understand this is a discussion of B.H. Roberts, and I said, well, if you want to study B.H. Roberts' thought, you read The Truth, the Way, and the Life. That was his last book, and how he felt was his summation of the gospel. But if you want to study the gospel, you start from the scriptures, and you eliminate the middleman, although there is a place for studying the writings of prophets. I mean, I've written a book on the book of Job, but you understand, you always go back to the source, you always go to God. What happens when you have conflicting prophets? President Hinckley said one thing about the correct name of the church. President Russell M. Nelson said another thing, and President Nelson really clamped down on this. Okay, how do you sort that out? Other things, is God progressing in knowledge? Can we progress from kingdom to kingdom? You're quoting your authority, but what does God have to say on the matter? And for Gen Y millennials and Gen Z, it shifts to podcasted influencers. Well, my podcaster said this, my podcaster said that. Another variation of this is local authorities. My mission president said such and such, or I had a bishop that said that. Or one of my personal favorites, back in my last ward. Okay, bishops don't have keys to determine doctrine, and what was going on in your last ward, it may not apply to this ward because it's a different ward with different keys. Thirdly, this division can lead to apostasy. And we had a case for this back when I was a kid, back when I was in my first year at college. We had a general authority get excommunicated. His name was George P. Lee. He was DNA or Navajo, and was called as the general authority when he was in his 30s. He had a PhD and was a principal, and called by President Spencer W. Kimball, who, if you understand, had a strong affinity with Native Americans. And this was a big thing. First Lamanite general authority called in this dispensation, and was just a harbinger of great things with the time of Lamanites at hand. What happened is later on, President Kimball died, President Benson became president of the church, and he changed some of the direction that the church was going in regards to Native Americans. And this really chafed George P. Lee. He also had some ideas about red power that weren't quite in harmony, and eventually he was excommunicated in 1989 for apostasy. Not all, but part. He was also later came out that he was molesting children while he was a general authority and advocated polygamy. So he's excommunicated for apostasy. And part of the problem, but not all, is that he was stuck with President Kimball When President Kimball died, his testimony died, and President Benson. And it's a sad story, really, a tragic figure. At my age, I always kind of wonder what it'd be like to be called a general authority when you're in your 30s. I wrote my book when I was 33, but yeah, certainly at that time. I mean, I got ordained in a high priest back when I was 46 years old, and yeah, that it may be an experiential thing because I wasn't called into leadership positions. I sort of accidentally. I mean, that's not a good term, but when you're in your mid 40s, as opposed to people who get called as high priest when they're in their 20s, it's a different experience in the church. So, getting a testimony or getting emotionally attached to general authorities or to pundits. So I had a. This is another story. We had another instructor and just taught stuff from Hugh Nibley. So all our classes were about what Hugh Nibley said on a matter, and that wasn't teaching the gospel. That was popularizing Hugh Nibley, and it wasn't what we should be doing. It was really kind of problematic, and the local bishop let it slide, and classes weren't as powerful as it could be. So that's enough about unity. It's a little bit tricky. You quote a general authority, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but getting emotionally attached to the point where you ignore other general authorities, excuse me, that's telestial. So preaching, how do you preach? Well, there's two approaches. Paul's working within the context of a Greco-Roman culture where you have a lot of philosophy going on, Socrates, logic and reason. Hugh Nibley wrote an essay called Victoriosa Loquacitas, The Rise of Rhetoric and the Decline of Everything Else. Pretty clever. Christ's approach, it's by the Spirit, 1 Corinthians 2:4, not by enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. So you have enticing man's words wisdom, or the Spirit and power, and we know which direction we need to follow. Brigham Young Manual, chapter 33 says, debate and argument have not that saving effect that has testifying to the truth as the Lord reveals it to the elders by the Spirit. I think you'll all agree with me in this, at least such is my experience. I do not wish to be understood as throwing a straw in the way of the elders storing their minds with all the arguments they can gather to urge in defense of their religion, nor do I wish to hinder them in the least from learning all they can with regard to the religions and the governments. The more knowledge the elders have, the better. But it just comes down to the teaching by the Spirit. And you also have your teaching, the method of it, but also the content of it. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified. Unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. And you have these cultural barriers with the Jews, with the crucifixion, because if you're crucified, it was a sign of an abomination, a sign of uncleanliness. And the Greeks just thought it was absolutely foolish that you'd have a God come down and atone for sins. You also have another aspect of the process is found in section 50, where you need to have the teacher and the hearer both be in tune with the Spirit. So it's not one or one, but there's an equilibrium of power. Another thing, too, is teaching with milk and meat. Boyd K. Packer said, avoid the tendency to feed meat when milk would suffice. Avoid the tendency to feed meat when milk would suffice. You answer the question with the lowest common denominator, because a lot of the advanced stuff comes with your own personal study and personal revelation. So, point 6 had to deal with some relations going on in Corinthians. There's an issue of incest. There's the issue of lawsuits. President Downey Chokes, in his book, The Lord's Way, has a chapter on litigation, which I'd recommend reading. There's a problem with interfaith marriages, so Section 74 gives a nice commentary on this. Judgment, and Paul's writing, and he says, I'm writing according to judgment, not by commandment. Read Alma 40:20, is sometimes prophets say, look, I don't have revelation on this, so this is what I think that the wise thing would be. And you have some of those are recorded in Scripture, and this is a case of that. Here's a sneaky one about life in general. Joseph Smith translation on 1 Corinthians 7:14 flips the meaning of that verse to the exact opposite. Like I said, some of Paul's quotable quotes, the Joseph Smith translation changes them. That's the importance of paying attention to the Joseph Smith translation. So, well, we're at 14, so I spent a lot of time on unity, but it's a big thing when you show up to church and people are going on about their favorite pundits and causing divisions because one general authority said one thing and another one said another thing. So here's the Christ quotient. Avoid worldly wisdom. Quote, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, from chapter 1, verse 25. And as you're interacting with the world, pay for the gift of discernment. For in those days there shall also rise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if possible, they shall deceive the very elect, who are the elect according to the covenant. Joseph Smith, Matthew, verse 22. And when you teach, make sure you're following the Lord's pattern. 2 Nephi 28 talks about the churches that rely upon man's wisdom. So two references to this are J. Reuben Clark's The Chartered Course of the Church in Education. I have a link to that, Chartered Course of the Church in Education. Then Alder McConkey's talk, The Foolishness of Teaching. And the last thing is about unity. Okay, unity is not sameness. Unity is not keeping quiet about your differences and put on a plastic smile. It's about charity. It's about a gift of the Spirit. It's an outgrowth of the atonement, which is the great miracle of unity. And unity is a concerted effort to come unto Christ. And coming unto Christ, that's the point.